There are brand names every American recognizes on sight: Toyota, Volkswagen, Samsung. But strangely, there's a group of countries that never made it onto that list: Australia, Canada, Russia, and Brazil. What these four countries have in common is striking: massive land area, resources to spare, and low population density. For reference, combine all four and you get more than 3 times the land area of the continental United States. That's how enormous these countries really are. On paper, they check every box economists usually associate with a rich country. Yet they share one more thing in common that you wouldn't expect: weak manufacturing. These resource giants, which seem to have won the geographic lottery, have almost no global manufacturing companies dominating world markets. Compare that to the US with Ford and Boeing, Germany with Volkswagen, or South Korea with Samsung and Hyundai. It's a striking contrast. Instead, these countries' exports are led by raw materials and commodities: iron ore, oil, grain, timber. Today, we're digging into why these countries never became manufacturing powerhouses, how abundant resources actually held manufacturing back, and what manufacturing really needs to thrive. Let's define what we mean by resource giant more precisely. For this video, we set 3 criteria. First, the country's land area ranks in the world's top 10. Second, population density is less than half the global average. Third, raw materials and commodities make up more than half of total exports. Countries that meet all 3 criteria include Russia, Canada, Brazil, and Australia, along with Argentina, Kazakhstan, and Algeria. Russia, Canada, Brazil, and Australia all rank among the world's 6 largest countries by land area, and their population densities fall well short of half the global average. According to World Bank data, population density comes out to roughly 8 people per square mile in Australia, 10 in Canada, 23 in Russia, and just 65 in Brazil. For comparison, U.S. population density is about 94 people per square mile. That means Australia's population is spread out at less than 1/12 the density of the United States. Argentina, Kazakhstan, and Algeria fit a similar profile too, of course, but this video is going to focus on Australia, Canada, Russia, and Brazil, since they're in a different weight class when it comes to economic size and global influence. There are 6 major reasons these resource giants got pushed out of manufacturing. Let's start with 3 traps built into the economic structure itself. The first trap is what economists call Dutch disease. The term comes from the Netherlands, which struck a massive natural gas field in 1959 and made a fortune exporting it, only to watch its own currency shoot up in value and gut traditional manufacturing in the process. It's the textbook case of a resource blessing turning into an economic curse. The mechanism is simple. When a country exports massive quantities of oil, iron ore, or natural gas, huge amounts of foreign currency, dollars for instance, flood in, and that drives up the value of the local currency fast. And that's exactly where the trouble starts. Once the local currency strengthens, everything the country's factories make automatically gets more expensive overseas, purely because of the exchange rate. The quality hasn't changed, but the price has, so the products lose their edge abroad, and exports dry up. Meanwhile, cheap imports flood the domestic market, and factories serving the home market start shutting down too. This pattern repeats every time a resource giant hits a commodity boom. The factories take a direct hit from the exchange rate and lose their edge. Resources can be raw material for manufacturing, but at the same time, they're a paradox that undermines manufacturing's price competitiveness from the ground up. The second trap: a huge landmass never automatically means a huge market. It's tempting to assume more land means more factories and more sales. But what matters for manufacturing isn't the size of the country, it's economic density. Manufacturing is an industry where costs drop the more you sell. Building a plant, whether for cars, appliances, or smartphones, takes an enormous amount of capital upfront. The more units you produce, the more you can spread that construction and R&D cost across each unit, which lowers the price. This is called economies of scale. For that to work, you need a consumer market big enough to absorb everything rolling off the line. But these resource giants have far too few people relative to their land area, so the domestic market itself stays small. What makes it worse is that even this small population is scattered across a handful of hub cities thousands of miles apart. So even if you build a plant, the customers aren't clustered nearby. You have to ship your products a long way just to find buyers. The result is that large-scale production becomes hard to sustain, and economies of scale, manufacturing's biggest advantage, never really kick in. Manufacturing doesn't want a big country. It wants a tight, dense market, tens of millions of people packed into a small footprint, like South Korea or Taiwan. For resource giants, all that empty land isn't a blessing for manufacturing. It's a massive obstacle that fragments the market and blocks economies of scale. The third trap: the bigger the country, the more shipping costs balloon. Manufacturing doesn't run on a single factory. It relies on a long supply chain, hauling in raw materials, making parts, assembling them, and shipping the finished product back out to a port for export that has to run without a single hitch. But when a country is this vast, every leg of that journey gets stretched to an extreme. Iron ore has to travel thousands of miles to reach a steel mill. The steel plate made there has to travel again to a car plant, and the finished car has to travel yet again to a port. The longer the distance, the higher the freight bill, the longer the lead time, and the more inventory you're forced to hold. Manufacturing costs snowball fast. The resource industry, by contrast, can handle long distances just fine. Iron ore or crude oil doesn't lose value moving slowly by freight train or pipeline, and because it ships in such enormous bulk, the per-unit cost stays manageable. The supply chain is relatively simple, too. Manufacturing is a different story. Every stage racks up brutal overland shipping costs, and any delay can mean the product is already priced out of the global market by the time it gets there. It's the classic curse of shipping costs eating the product itself alive. A vast landmass works in favor of the resource industry, but for manufacturing, where you want your suppliers, factories, and ports as close together as possible, it becomes a serious liability instead. Now that we've covered the three structural traps, let's turn to the reasons rooted in people and geography and see how all of this ultimately points to one single conclusion. The fourth reason: the resource industry claims all the money and talent first. Once a resource company has proven reserves locked up, it's highly profitable and stable. Even a small bump in oil or iron ore prices translates to astronomical profits. That lets resource companies pay their workers extremely high wages. There's another quirk unique to the resource industry. You can't just relocate a mine or oil field to another country because labor got expensive. Iron ore is in Australia. Oil is in the Middle East. No matter how high wages climb, you're stuck digging it up right where it is. That's why resource companies happily paid top dollar to attract workers. And with that kind of pull, the country's best talent and capital gets sucked into mining and energy like a black hole. Manufacturing is a different story entirely. Not only does building a plant and developing the technology require a massive upfront investment, but the risk of failing in the global market is steep too. Most importantly, if labor costs get too high, a car plant or appliance factory can just pack up and move to a country with cheaper wages, and companies absolutely do this. From a company's standpoint, there's no reason to stay put in a resource giant where wages have shot through the roof. Even when a manufacturer tries to hire skilled engineers to run a plant, they've all gone off to mines and oil fields, and capital flows the same direction, straight into resources. So manufacturing ends up chronically starved of both workers and funding. The more resource-rich a country is, the more its pool of capital and talent for manufacturing tends to dry up, a strange side effect. The fifth reason: these countries sit too far from the world's major manufacturing belts. Modern manufacturing no longer happens start to finish inside one country. It runs on a global supply chain woven together like a spider web, with every region playing its own role. Parts made in Asia, assembly in North America, consumption in Europe, and so on. So to succeed in manufacturing, it helps enormously to sit right next to the world's manufacturing hubs, or the key trade routes where parts and freight are constantly moving. But Australia and Brazil sit physically far from North America, East Asia, and Western Europe, the major consumer markets and manufacturing hubs. You have to cross the Pacific or the Atlantic just to get there. Russia is so vast that even its own industry and markets are scattered far apart from east to west. Canada, meanwhile, sits right next to the huge U.S. market, but that proximity makes it nearly impossible to maintain its own independent manufacturing edge. Compare that to Germany, sitting right in the middle of the European market, or South Korea and Taiwan, anchored at the heart of East Asia's manufacturing belt, or China, positioned as the hub of the world's factory floor. Set side by side, it becomes clear just how far Australia, Canada, Russia, and Brazil sit from those belts. That means even shipping a single part back and forth costs far more time and money than it would for competitors. What matters in manufacturing isn't the size of your country, it's how close you sit to the world's manufacturing belt. Now for the sixth and most fundamental reason. All 5 points we've covered so far actually funnel into a single conclusion: the absence of an industrial cluster. When we think of manufacturing, we usually picture one massive factory, but modern manufacturing is never built on a single plant. Building a single car alone takes more than 30,000 parts. A steel company rolls the sheet metal, an electronics maker supplies semiconductors and sensors, a tooling company stamps out the molds, a chemical company provides the paint and plastics, a logistics company moves everything on a tight schedule, and a software company builds the self-driving and infotainment systems. Only when thousands of these suppliers move together like one organism does a single car roll off the line. Having all these suppliers packed tightly together, close enough to respond instantly to any situation, that's what an industrial cluster is, and that's where manufacturing's real competitive edge comes from. Inside this ecosystem, a newly developed part can be carried to the plant next door the same day to build a prototype, and if a problem crops up, a solution can be found within hours. No amount of capital can manufacture that kind of speed and density overnight. This is exactly where the resource giants run into trouble. Money and people pile up only around mines and oil fields, while manufacturing suppliers sit thousands of miles apart. Even if you build a plant somewhere, there's no cluster forming around it. Sourcing a single part can take days, and there's no nearby supplier to fix a technical problem on the spot. The plant ends up operating like an isolated island, and productivity and competitiveness keep sliding. Manufacturing isn't just an industry that builds factories, it's an industry that builds an ecosystem where thousands of companies, workers, and technologies live and grow together. Dutch disease, empty market density, crushing logistics costs, resource industries hoarding talent, and geographic isolation all combine to produce the missing cluster. And that's the deepest answer to why countries with all the land and resources never became manufacturing powers. For resource giants, all that empty land is barren soil where this ecosystem simply can't take root. So, how do these resource giants keep their economies running without manufacturing? Broadly, they faced two paths: give up on manufacturing early and lean into their strengths, or keep pushing forward and try to crack manufacturing anyway. Australia and Canada took the first path. Behind Australia's choice lies a bitter history. It once had to walk away entirely from an auto industry that was a genuine point of national pride. Australia used to be a legitimate car manufacturing nation, home to its own domestic brand, Holden, alongside plants run by global players like Toyota and Ford. For Australians, Holden wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of national identity. But reality was unforgiving. The population was small, wages were high, and the domestic market was limited. Australia had every structural weakness of a resource giant that we've covered so far. The government eventually had no choice but to cut off massive subsidies and let uncompetitive industries go. Ford's and Toyota's local plants shut down one after another starting in 2013, and when Holden closed its Adelaide plant in 2017, it marked the final end of Australia's 70-year history of car manufacturing. It was a brutal restructuring that left tens of thousands of skilled manufacturing workers out of a job. But after living through that painful failure, Australia made a clean break from manufacturing. Instead, it built resource exports, the thing it was actually good at, as its foundation, then layered finance, tourism, and high-value services on top, creating an entirely new kind of advanced economy. Canada followed a similar path, though its method was a bit different. Rather than growing its own manufacturing brands, Canada chose to plug itself directly into its neighbor's giant manufacturing supply chain, the United States. When American car and aircraft companies built plants near the border, Canada took on the role of supplying them with parts and intermediate goods. Companies that fit that role survived, and now form the backbone of Canadian manufacturing. Independent manufacturers that didn't fit that role couldn't withstand the weaknesses of being a resource giant and gradually faded away. The result of that choice was clear. Canadian manufacturing became fully dependent on the U.S. market. The fate of the entire country's manufacturing sector now hinges on American business cycles and trade policy. But it's fair to call this Canada's most realistic, if unavoidable, choice. Australia and Canada took slightly different paths, but they shared one thing in common. They faced up to the limits that come with a massive landmass and refused to fixate on manufacturing as the only path forward. Instead, they committed, without regret, to what they were actually good at. And that choice is exactly what keeps both countries counted among the world's advanced economies today. Russia and Brazil, on the other hand, went a different route. They never accepted the structural limits of manufacturing and staked their national future on becoming manufacturing powers no matter what. Their dream wasn't just to sell raw materials, it was to become industrial nations that build finished products. Russia built its manufacturing base around military-industrial heavy industry, trying to construct its own independent ecosystem centered on the massive defense industry and aerospace technology that carried over from the Cold War era. Brazil leveraged its sizable domestic market as a weapon, pouring investment into cars, aircraft, and steel. The belief was that with enough state backing and capital, even the limitations of being a resource giant could be overcome. But the wall of reality turned out to be much higher than expected. The structural limits we've covered weren't easy to overcome. Whenever oil, iron ore, or soybean prices climbed, the currency would spike and manufacturing exports would take a hit. Whenever prices dropped, the entire national economy would shake, a vicious cycle repeating itself over and over. Logistics infrastructure that was hopelessly inadequate relative to the country's size meant that even moving a single part demanded huge amounts of time and money. On top of that, Russia had to deal with international sanctions and weak foreign investment, while Brazil struggled under a tangle of complicated taxes and regulations, and in the end, neither country managed to grow a true industrial cluster. There are exceptions fighting hard in specific niches, of course, like Brazil's aircraft maker Embraer, but there's still a wide gap between them and the countries actually leading global manufacturing, like Germany, Japan, or South Korea. Even so, Russia and Brazil haven't given up on manufacturing. Their determination to become manufacturing powers is second to none. But the two countries' long-running struggle proves that the vast ecosystem manufacturing requires isn't something national willpower and resources alone can simply buy. So, one last question naturally comes to mind. The US and China have the largest land areas in the world and virtually unlimited resources. So, how did they become global manufacturing powers? Are they the exception? Not really. The short answer is that they didn't escape the rule we've laid out at all. The secret behind both the US and China is that even though their countries are massive, they concentrated manufacturing into a handful of extremely dense regions rather than spreading it across the whole nation. The US packed people, companies, ports, and supply chains into industrial belts around the Great Lakes, the South, and the West Coast. China concentrated everything into its massive coastal urban clusters in the east. Rather than trying to fill the entire country with manufacturing, they compressed population and industry into specific points and engineered artificially high density. Think of it as planting a hyper-dense manufacturing nation, something like South Korea or Taiwan, right inside a much bigger territory, on purpose. Add in the cheat code of an overwhelming population and a massive domestic market, and you get a global manufacturing powerhouse. But recent trends show that even these giants haven't been able to fully dodge the paradox of a massive landmass. The US once prioritized efficiency and scattered its manufacturing supply chain across the globe. As a result, it had to pay the painful price of watching its own traditional manufacturing ecosystem collapse. That's exactly why the US has recently been promising enormous subsidies to pull manufacturing plants from around the world back onto American soil. Even a global superpower has learned, the hard way, that a broken industrial cluster can threaten a nation's future. Building a factory is the easy part of manufacturing. Building and maintaining the ecosystem around it is far harder. That ecosystem takes decades to build, and it can collapse in an instant. Once manufacturing collapses, it's incredibly hard to bring back. An ecosystem of factories, infrastructure, and skilled workers built up over decades, once it's dismantled, can't be easily restored by any amount of money or political power. In the end, it comes down to this: you have to take care of it while you still have it. At the end of the day, manufacturing isn't just a single factory building, it's a massive ecosystem where countless gears mesh together perfectly. And the reason the US is now pouring vast sums of capital into pulling its offshored supply chains back home is almost certainly because it has learned, painfully, just how irreplaceable that ecosystem really is. I hope today's video helped shed some light on the massive currents of global economics and geopolitics hiding behind the everyday objects we use. So, can the Rust Belt around the Great Lakes reclaim its former glory and spark a new manufacturing renaissance on American soil? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, please subscribe and hit that like button for the Professor Her Room channel. Next time, I'll be back with another clear, in-depth breakdown of the complex intersection of geopolitics, history, and culture that shapes our world. This has been Lydia from Professor Her Room. Thanks for watching.